Most people assume that someone who treats their birthday like a normal day simply doesn't care, that they've outgrown the ritual, that they are above the cake and the noise and the manufactured sentiment of it all. But that assumption misses something, because indifference, real indifference, doesn't require effort. And the person who says, "I don't care about my birthday," the one who insists the day means nothing, who actively discourages any acknowledgement of it, that person is often working at it. There is something being managed, something being held carefully at a distance. What looks like detachment from the outside is, from the inside, frequently a system, a set of learned responses built over years, sometimes decades, designed to make sure that a single day on the calendar cannot touch them, but not always. And that distinction matters. Some people treat their birthday like a normal day simply because that is who they are, not because of conditioning, not because of early disappointment, but because their personality genuinely does not orient towards social ritual. Introverts who find concentrated attention draining rather than energizing. Private people who experience public recognition as intrusion rather than warmth. Individuals who have never needed symbolic occasions to feel the weight of what they mean to others. For these people, a quiet birthday is not armor. It is just preference, as natural and uncomplicated as not liking crowds. Understanding that this exists is important before going further, because what follows is not about everyone who prefers a low-key day. It is about a specific subset of people for whom the indifference is not quite as simple as it appears. This video is not about people who simply forgot to care. It is about people who remember, very precisely, why they stopped. The question worth asking is not whether these people care about their birthdays. The real question is, what happened that made caring feel like a risk? Because something did happen. It rarely happens once, and it rarely happens dramatically. It accumulates. The psychology of a person who gradually withdrew from their own birthday is often the psychology of someone who was affected, who felt something, who reached toward the expectation that this one day might be different, and who found, repeatedly, that the distance between what they felt and what actually arrived was too wide to keep crossing without cost. Expectation is the operative word here. Psychologists who study emotional conditioning, particularly in the context of repeated disappointment, note that the human brain is not passive in the face of unmet expectations. It adapts. It begins to preempt the outcome. When a person experiences a consistent pattern in which anticipation produces disappointment, the brain does not simply endure the cycle indefinitely. It begins to dismantle the anticipation itself, not through conscious decision, but through a gradual recalibration of what feels safe to want. Birthdays, for people with this kind of history, can become a compressed annual reminder of an old experience. And so the brain does what it tends to do with experiences that carry pain. It learns not to press there. For many of these people, the original conditioning began in childhood, not necessarily through neglect in any dramatic or obvious sense. Sometimes it was subtler, a birthday that was promised something and quietly delivered something less, a celebration that felt more like a performance for others than a recognition of them, a household where emotional expression was guarded, where self-celebration felt slightly dangerous, too loud, too demanding, too exposed. Children in those environments often absorb something early. Wanting things out loud can lead to disappointment. Needing things visibly can feel like becoming a burden. And so they adapt, as children always do, to the emotional temperature of the room. They learn to want quietly, then to want privately, then eventually to want so far inward that even they stop hearing it clearly. By the time they are adults, these people have often developed a complicated relationship with being the focus of attention, one that can run deeper than ordinary shyness. Being celebrated requires a person to stand still and receive, to let people look at them, to accept that their existence is, in this moment, the point. For someone who absorbed early that their needs were secondary or inconvenient or conditional, this is not always a comfortable position. It can surface something old, something that sounds like, don't take up too much space, don't need too much, don't make people have to deal with you. So they make themselves easy. They say it's not a big deal. They mean it, and they don't mean it simultaneously. And that simultaneity is not contradiction. It is a learned psychological response operating exactly as it was built to. Research in developmental and attachment psychology suggests that people who repeatedly found external sources of validation unreliable will often develop strong internal regulation systems instead. They become their own witness, their own measuring stick. Externally, this looks like self-sufficiency. Internally, it is something more complicated. A person who has trained themselves out of needing, not because needing is wrong, but because needing proved too costly too often. The self-sufficiency is real, and it is also, in part, a scar that learned to present as a skill. They tend to be observant, often deeply so. They process experience through an internal lens that many people around them never fully access. They carry a quiet attentiveness to emotional dynamics, not simply as a personality trait, but because historically, reading the room accurately was useful. A child who grows up in an emotionally unpredictable environment can develop a heightened sensitivity to social cues. An adult who grew up that way may become someone highly attuned to the difference between performed care and genuine presence. That attentiveness sometimes shows up, quietly, around their birthday. Here is a pattern worth naming, though it does not apply to everyone in this group. Some people who claim not to care about their birthday are running what might be called a silent test. They do not announce expectations. They do not ask for anything, but they are watching more carefully than they will admit. Who remembered without a social media prompt, whether the message felt personal or recycled? Who said nothing at all? None of this gets processed with outward drama. There is no confrontation, no acknowledgement, but internally, the information is registered. Because despite the genuine discomfort with being celebrated, despite the authentic preference for a quiet day, there remains, in some of these people, a part that still wanted to be held in someone's mind without having to ask. They will not say that. Some would find it genuinely difficult to think it that directly, but when the pattern exists, it tends to be precise and consistent. Not because these people are testing out of calculation, but because old attentiveness does not simply turn off when the stakes are raised. This is part of the emotional paradox that can define this experience. The performance of indifference, over time, becomes partly real, partly protective, and partly a story that makes the mathematics of disappointment more manageable. Caring less, on paper, means losing less. But the emotional reality rarely cooperates with that logic as cleanly as the strategy requires, and some part of the person carrying it quietly knows that. There is also something distinct operating in the more introspective members of this group, an existential relationship with time that gives the birthday a gravity most social rituals don't carry. For these individuals, the day is not merely a social occasion. It functions as an annual reckoning. A birthday forces a person to stand at a specific coordinate in their own timeline. And unlike most days, which pass without demanding reflection, the birthday arrives with an implicit question. What has the year actually been? It invites a comparison that is not always comfortable, between who you are now and who you assumed you would be, between what you built and what you were certain at some earlier point that you were building, between the life that is actually unfolding and the one that existed with such clarity in earlier versions of your own imagination. That gap between the person at 37 and the person 37-year-old you was supposed to be is a specific kind of confrontation that the birthday makes unavoidable. For deeply introspective people, this existential dimension can become the primary reason they resist celebration, not because they don't want to be recognized, but because the day is already asking them to do something substantial, to honestly evaluate where they are, what they've done with the time, and what they still haven't said or started or finished. That is a significant amount to hold, while also maintaining a social performance of gratitude and lightness. The two things do not sit easily together, and so some of them make a quiet decision to face the reckoning on their own terms, without the noise of other people's expectations layered on top of their own. The preference for a normal day is, in this reading, not detachment from the occasion. It is a form of private respect for it, a refusal to let the ritual dilute what the day genuinely means to them. The personality patterns that sometimes appear in people who approach their birthdays this way are worth observing, even if they do not apply in every case. A tendency toward emotional self-containment, a preference for depth over breadth in their closest relationships, a discomfort with social scripts that feel hollow or performative. In some cases, a kind of accelerated emotional maturity, not chosen, but developed out of necessity, that came from having to process adult complexity before the developmental moment when it would have arrived more naturally. A learned hesitation around expressed enthusiasm, not because the capacity for it is absent, but because at some point, visible enthusiasm became visible vulnerability, and visible vulnerability led somewhere painful. These patterns are not a checklist that defines this group. They are threads that sometimes appear together, pointing toward the same underlying experience, the quiet, long-held conviction that it is safer to be the person who didn't care than the person who cared openly and was overlooked. And that, finally, is the center of it, the architecture underneath the indifference. It is not that the day means nothing. It is that allowing the day to mean something opens a specific door, the one where you are permitted to need something from the people around you, where you are allowed to be the recipient rather than the giver, where being thought of without prompting is the whole point. And that door, for people with this history, has not always opened onto something reliable, so they close it themselves first before it has the chance to disappoint them. And they call it not caring, because not caring is a dignified position, and the truth that they care with a precision they have never allowed themselves to fully express is harder to carry in plain sight. What is worth recognizing about these people is not the detachment. It is the endurance, the capacity to absorb repeated emotional quietude without letting resentment become the defining feature of how they move through the world requires a kind of inner stability that is frequently mistaken for coldness. These are often deeply feeling people. They are simply feeling people who learn to feel privately. They have become generous in many cases, in exactly the ways they do not allow themselves to be the recipient of. That generosity has limits, even when those limits are rarely acknowledged. A person who has permanently rerouted every instance of being cared for back into the machinery of self-sufficiency is a person running on reserves that do not replenish the way human reserves are built to replenish. The people who treat their birthday like a normal day are not people without feeling. They are, in many cases, people who felt precisely enough and specifically enough to decide that the feeling was safer kept close. They built something quiet and strong around themselves. They made a choice, or the choice was shaped for them, gradually, by circumstances they did not entirely control, and they have maintained it ever since with a discipline most people around them will never notice. Because discipline, when it works, looks like nothing at all. If you recognize something in this, not everything, but something, you probably already understood most of it on some level. You just hadn't heard it framed this directly before. And maybe that, on its own, is worth something.